Yemen is a desert country in the Middle East on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen is bordered on the north by Saudi Arabia and on the east by Oman. The language mainly spoken in Yemen is Arabic, and the main religion is Islam. They were known for coffee and silversmiths.
The current crisis in Yemen is continually getting worse, with no end in sight. Children, women, single men, and elderly people continue to die every day, even with the humanitarian aid of powerful organizations. The war is reaching uncontrollable and catastrophic levels.
The conflict is between the Houthi/pro-Saleh forces, the Haiti government, and Al-Qaeda. It started when Ali Abdullah Saleh was forced to give leadership over Yemen to Abdurrahman Mansur Hadi. The transition in leadership led to a massive unemployment, a lack of food, an increase in suicide and bombings and terrorism, and a separation movement. All of this contributed to starting the war. The violence worsened an already terrible humanitarian crisis. More than 10,000 civilians have been killed and more than 42,000 have been injured in the fighting. Millions more have been killed by starvation and disease. In August 2016, the United Nations laid out a number of serious allegations of violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law committed by all sides. There's been a lot of humanitarian aid delivered to Yemen, but none of it has made the situation better.
Some 3.3 million people have been displaced since March 2015. As of January 2017, more than 2 million remain displaced. 1 million returned to their homes, and 180,000 have fled the country. The government says there are also between 1.7 and 2 million refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in Yemen who came from other countries, 460,000 of whom need humanitarian assistance. The refugee crisis is becoming more uncontrollable as more and more people flee in hopes for a better life.
More than 1.6 million elderly people in Yemen are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. Over 95% of older women and men have no access to any income, and less than 2% of the elderly population can afford the medication they need to survive. Although everyone in Yemen undergoes a lot of suffering in their daily lives, elderly people on average significantly suffer more. While many people in Yemen are able to fend for themselves, elderly people have a more difficult time surviving. This translates to a high number of them dying off from what we think of as treatable diseases. Although elderly people make up 5% of cholera cases, they are responsible for 30% of the deaths. This is because many do not have access to safe, dependable health care and have a more vulnerable immune system. The war in Yemen also contributes to the high amounts of death by disease, when hospitals are destroyed and medical supplies can't reach people in need. Aside from having a higher chance of dying from disease, elderly people are also more often overlooked and left behind when fleeing because of their physical limitations. Zainab is a 50-year-old woman with 4 sons living in the district of Al-Wazi'iyah, one of the poorest regions in Yemen. Zainab works very hard to feed herself and her 4 sons, 2 of whom are disabled. But as the war worsens and prices continue to increase, it has become harder and harder. In her words, Zainab says, "Food prices skyrocketed way beyond our coping capacity. People have no more savings left nor possessions to buy food. I was supposed to rest at this age, yet I work hard so I can buy minimum food for my children at the huge inflated prices." Nothing specifically is being done to help elderly people in Yemen, and as the war continues, their situation will only become worse.
Our next demographic is children. Over 10,200 children have been killed or maimed since the beginning of the conflict. Thousands more have been recruited into the fighting. An estimated 2 million children are internally displaced. The damage and closure of schools and hospitals has severely disrupted access to education and health services. More than 2 million children are out of schools, leaving them even more vulnerable. Even the children who are lucky enough to go to school still face the threat that they may be a target. Omar is one of the many children who has been impacted by the war. "Every morning that my child goes to school, my heart feels heavy," said Omar's father. Omar and his brother Muhammad were walking in the neighborhood one day when an artillery shell hit. Tragically, Muhammad died before he could be treated at the hospital. Omar wishes he could still play with his late brother, and the emotional toll of losing his siblings and sustaining his own critical injuries will likely endure long after the wounds have healed.
UNICEF, which stands for the United Nations Children Fund, is on the ground to save children's lives, to help them cope with the impact of the conflict, and to help them recover and resume their childhoods. Conflict and violence have pushed more families into poverty. UNICEF is helping treat severe acute malnutrition in children by providing essential food and medical supplies. Children are also being helped with victim assistance and education on mines and explosive remains of war. Meanwhile, UNICEF and partners are rehabilitating damaged schools and establishing safe learning spaces. The crisis is affecting people who should not be affected. With UNICEF, there's hope, but right now, more and more children are becoming victims of a war their parents started.
Our next demographic is young single men. Yemen is made up of 60% young men. Young men are forced to fight no matter where they are fled internally. Remarkably young men are volunteering to clean up the parts of Yemen that have been destroyed. There is a camp in Yemen where young women and men between the ages of 16 and 70 were given cameras to film the lives of these people in these camps. One of the young men, Kiri Saeed Ahmad, took this photo of his father. This photo shows the pain and exhaustion war causes. He looks tired and done with this violence. Young men in Yemen are put in and cause danger on the daily. They can also be upstanding citizens for their loved country.
Our next demographic is women. Women in Yemen don't have the easiest lives. They are one of the vulnerable populations of any refugee group. Girls and women are often forced to drop out of school and marry young as a coping mechanism to deal with hunger. Gender-based violence and abuse are common but largely unreported. Pregnant and lactating women are suffering from severe acute malnutrition and becoming infected with disease such as malaria and dengue that have long been eradicated in other parts of the world. Despite their suffering, these strong and ever-resilient women will stop at nothing to build a better future. Around 78% of refugee mothers and caregivers in Yemen are illiterate. For many years, structural inequalities in the country have hampered girls' access to educate, resulting in a significant gender gap in literacy and basic education. Continuing to educate refugee girls even during lockdowns is critical to their empowerment and the future prosperity of their families, communities, and country. Today, 40% of the most vulnerable displaced families in Yemen do not have access to a steady income. They are selling off belongings, pulling children out of school, and sending them off to work. They are also begging on the streets just to put food on the table. Women are often the ones eating last and the least. The IRC is currently helping women in Yemen.
The crisis in Yemen has not been getting better, and in fact is getting worse and worse, and there's no sign they'll be getting better anytime soon. Everyone, children, men, elderly men, and women continue to suffer under the weight of a war that has been going on for too long.